Hi, this is Same Again, session 4. You can find sessions 1 to 3 on our website, sameagain.org/Hilton, or on our Facebook page. The recorded version of the Broadway show Hamilton was released recently. It's the story of one of the founding fathers of America. They fight the War of Independence and then have this opportunity to build the new world. A new start, a blank slate, free from the high taxes and overbearing rule of King George III. They're free to create the world they all wanted. But it becomes very quickly evident that all of the individuals involved are flawed. And their mistakes, their temper, their selfish ambition all start to ruin any hope there was of creating this paradise. People have been arguing ever since about whether what they did create was better or worse than what they had before, but they all agree that it's ultimately not the world we all want. There are big problems. In our last session, we saw God make promises to a man called Abraham. Humans had rejected God and become his enemies, but God promised a new people who would know him. We all reject God and make a mess of his good world, but God promises a new world, a place of security, plenty, and rest. The Bible is the story of how God goes about keeping that promise. And in this session, we're going to focus on 3 things. First, we see that God has done amazing things for his people. God set his people free and gave them a land of good things. The events we're looking at in this session are so spectacular and larger than life that they've been made into a number of different Hollywood blockbusters. In Egypt, God's people were not free to worship God, and they were far away from the land that he'd promised them. So God sent Moses to lead the people out of Egypt and back to the promised land. God sent plagues on Egypt to persuade the king to let God's people go free. And the last plague, most horrible of all, was the death of the firstborn child in every household. Even after letting them go, the king then changed his mind and chased after them. The Israelites found themselves trapped between the Red Sea and the Egyptian army. It looked like there was no escape. But God miraculously parted the Red Sea so that they could pass through. When the Egyptians followed, the waters closed in on them and they were all drowned. God had set his people free. We call this the Exodus, which means the going out or the exit. God had rescued his people out of Egypt. He judged the enemies of his people who refused to obey his word. Between Egypt and the Promised Land, at Mount Sinai, God gave his people a set of laws. The rule of the king of Egypt had been harsh and cruel, but God's law would protect his people from cruelty. It was a rule of blessing, a rule of freedom. And at the heart of the law was the 10 Commandments, and at the heart of the 10 Commandments was the Sabbath, a word that means rest. The Sabbath day was a special day of rest that was a sign of the everlasting rest that God had promised them. In Egypt, the descendants of Abraham were slaves whose lives were all work, work, and more work. By giving them this one day of rest, God was reminding them that his rest, not their work, was their destiny. It was a weekly glimpse at the world we all want. God told his people that all the other nations would be amazed at how good it was to live under God's rule, that people would be attracted to God through the life of his people, that they would be a light to the nations. So we've seen God rescue his people and set them free. But how would they get on in this promised land? The answer's not good. Because the second thing we see is that even God's free, rescued people cannot create his new world. You'd think that at last we would see a perfect society built. Now God's rescued his people and given them a law of freedom and invited them in to enjoy his blessing. But the people problem still persists. The descendants of Abraham still don't trust God or obey him. God invited them into his land. He said that he would fight for them and give them victory, but they were afraid. And they allowed fear to rule their hearts rather than faith, and they refused to take the land. So a whole generation died wandering in the desert. But God didn't give up. He gave the land to the next generation. They won remarkable and amazing victories. But the good times didn't last long. Yet again, the people didn't trust God or obey him. They started to follow other gods, false gods, and cruel practices. Instead of being a light to the nations, they followed the ways of those nations and were corrupted by them. Finally, the people were exiled in Babylon. The land was captured and the promise to Abraham seemed to fail. The people made a complete mess of living as God's people in God's land because they doubted his word and rejected his rule. The lesson is clear. We can't create the world we all want. Though many have tried, our dreams of perfection always fail. Some people do it by escaping to create perfect communities, only to find that the problems they hoped they could leave behind follow them. Like in Hamilton, some people try bringing it about by a revolution. But time and time again, what starts out full of idealism becomes corrupt and oppressive. Today we often try to create our own little paradise with a good income and a lovely home and a secure future. But if coronavirus has taught us anything, it's that these things are fragile and easily lost. And anyway, even at their best, they still don't provide hope after death, do they? We can't create the world we all want. Thousands, millions have tried, but all of them have ended in failure and disappointment. It seems this is a lesson we find impossible to learn. So we've seen that God rescues his people, but they continue to fail. Does that mean God's abandoned them? No. Because thirdly, we see that God promises that he will put it right. Ezekiel was a prophet, one of God's spokesmen. He speaks to the Israelites, exiled in Babylon. They must have thought that there was no hope left, but Ezekiel says, God promises to rescue his people from the nations. God promises to restore the land, and it will be like a new Garden of Eden. And most importantly, God promises to deal with our hearts. God will deal with the problem of rebellion at its root. He will make a new people. We can't create the world we all want, but God can. I want to ask 2 questions as we finish. First, why? Why will God do this? Why doesn't God just give up on us? It's not because we deserve to be rescued, because we don't. God will save us to show how great and how loving he is. God saves us to bring himself glory and worship. And that isn't selfish pride like it would be for us. It's because he is truly worthy. And secondly, how? How does God do it? How does he deal with our sin and with his judgment? Well, that's the question we'll look at in our next session.